May 326 BCE, the Hydaspes River, northern India. You're standing on the bank of a roaring river. On the far side, an army ready for war. Tens of thousands of soldiers, and something no enemy of Alexander has ever put on a battlefield before. Over 100 war elephants, lined up at the water's edge. At their head, King Porus, 7 feet tall, the only ruler in Asia who looked at Alexander's approaching army and refused to surrender. He has chosen his ground perfectly. The river is deep, the current violent. Alexander's horses won't cross near the elephants. The animals panic at the smell alone. Any crossing attempt under fire means drowning before you reach the other side. Alexander has conquered everything between Greece and India. He has never faced a problem he couldn't solve with speed and force. This river stopped him cold. Now, watch what happens. What he does next took weeks of preparation and one single night to change everything. By the time the sun rises, his army will be fighting outnumbered against war elephants capable of tearing his formations apart. This will become one of the bloodiest battles of his entire campaign. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how he did it. What followed was one of the most patient, calculated pieces of military theater in history. For weeks, Alexander did nothing, or appeared to do nothing. His men moved up and down the riverbank, loudly, visibly, scouting crossings, making noise, lighting fires. Every time they moved, Porus mirrored them on the other side, keeping his army in position. It was exhausting, and that was the point. Alexander was conditioning Porus to see movement and dismiss it. At night, Macedonian cavalry would ride to the riverbank with battle cries, as if a crossing was imminent. Porus would rush his troops to respond, and then nothing would happen. Again, and again, and again, until Porus stopped sending his full army, until his scouts stopped treating every movement as a genuine threat. Meanwhile, Alexander had already found his crossing point. 17 miles upstream from camp, a stretch of land dividing the river's flow, providing cover for the approach. Rafts and boats quietly assembled in secret over days. And to make sure Porus never suspected, a senior officer was dressed in Alexander's royal armor and kept visible in camp, moving between the tents, maintaining the illusion that the king was still there. On a stormy night in May, with thunder covering the sounds of 10,000 men moving through the dark, Alexander slipped away upstream with 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. The real crossing had begun. And then, immediately, it went wrong. After crossing the first channel in the dark and the rain, Alexander's men landed on what they believed was the far bank. It wasn't. It was an island. There was another channel ahead, narrower but still fast, and dawn was coming. They scrambled to get the boats and rafts across the island to the second channel, moving as fast as they could in the dark, knowing that every minute brought more light. They made it across, but not quietly enough. By the time Alexander's force reached the eastern bank and began to assemble, Porus's scouts had already seen them. The element of surprise, the single most important advantage in the entire plan, was gone. Alexander was now on the wrong side of the river with roughly a quarter of his total army, his infantry still catching up, his cavalry barely assembled, and Porus was already moving. Porus didn't wait to see what Alexander would do. He sent his son, also named Porus, with 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots to hit Alexander's force before it could fully form. It was a reasonable decision. If the detachment could pin Alexander at the riverbank, keep him disorganized, prevent his infantry from assembling, the main army could arrive and finish the job. But the monsoon had one more role to play. The ground near the bank was waterlogged, churned to mud by days of rain, and chariots need firm ground. The Indian chariots, which on dry terrain would have been devastating, bogged down almost immediately. Wheels sinking, horses struggling, formations breaking apart before they could charge. To buy time, Alexander's horse archers hit them first, raking the stalled chariots with arrows. The sudden pressure caught young Porus off guard, and he moved his cavalry in to support the chariots. Then, Alexander's heavy cavalry drove straight into the chaos. Both forces met head-on. Cavalry clashed, hard fighting on both sides. There were losses on both ends, but the companion cavalry had the edge. The chariots never found their footing. In the mud, they lost all advantage, reduced to obstacles more than weapons. As the line began to break, what remained of Porus's cavalry started to pull back. Young Porus tried to rally his men to stabilize the fight, but he was killed in the attempt. The detachment collapsed, and the survivors fell back toward the main army. King Porus was already on the move, marching toward the crossing. Now, with the news that his son was dead, he committed even further. Now the real situation came into focus. At the Hydaspes, both sides had brought full armies. Alexander had around 30,000 to 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and allied 5,000 allied Taxilian troops. Porus fielded a similar number of infantry, thousands of cavalry, hundreds of chariots, and more than 100 war elephants. The numbers were close, but that wasn't the situation on the ground, because at this moment, Alexander was still fighting with only a fraction of his army. The force that had crossed in the night, roughly 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Everything else was still across the river, so when Porus marched out to meet him, he was not facing the full Macedonian army at once. And the line he formed was formidable. Cavalry on both flanks, infantry in the center. War elephants stretched across the front, one every 50 feet. A living wall built to break the Macedonian phalanx before it could close. That was the problem in front of Alexander. Not the chariots. The mud had already reduced them. Not even the cavalry on the wings. The elephants. Because if they hit the phalanx head-on in good order, the Macedonian center could break. Alexander opened with a feint. His horse archers surged toward Porus's left flank, not to destroy it, but to pull it, to force the Indian cavalry on that side into a reaction. It worked. Porus shifted cavalry from his right to reinforce his left, trying to prevent it from being overrun. That was the signal. Coenus, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, had been waiting on the far side of the field with the 2nd Cavalry Wing. The moment Porus's right flank weakened, Coenus swung wide, circled behind the Indian line, and hit Porus's cavalry from the rear. The Indian horse, attacked from 2 directions simultaneously, folded under the pressure and fled toward the only protection they had, the elephants in the center. What followed in the center was unlike anything his men had faced before. The elephants charged. Steel-clad tusks, howdahs carrying archers, tons of panicked animal momentum. Men were impaled, men were lifted and thrown, men were simply crushed. The phalanx, for the first time in years, was taking catastrophic losses. But Alexander had prepared for this. Light infantry had been dispersed throughout the formation with one specific task: kill the mahouts. Without a rider to control it, a wounded elephant has no direction. It has only pain, noise, and the instinct to escape. The mahouts began to fall. And one by one, then in groups, the elephants turned, not toward Alexander's men, toward their own. Trumpeting, bleeding, terrified, they plowed back through Porus's infantry, crushing men who had no way to get clear, turning the Indian center into chaos. And only now did the rest of Alexander's plan fully close. Craterus, still on the opposite side earlier in the battle with the remaining force, finally crossed the river with the rest of the army once Porus was fully committed. Alexander's cavalry closed the ring. The phalanx pushed from the front. Craterus hit from the rear. The hammer and the anvil. There was nowhere left to go. Porus's army collapsed. But Porus did not collapse with the rest of his army. Even as his cavalry broke and his center gave way, he remained in the field. Wounded, still mounted on his elephant, he continued to fight as the battle ended around him. At some point, it was no longer a battle, just resistance. Alexander saw it. Instead of sending more troops, he sent a man Porus knew to ask him to stand down. Porus did. He dismounted and was brought before Alexander. When they met, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus answered simply, as one king would treat another. Alexander accepted. He restored Porus to his throne and expanded his territory. If this is the kind of history you enjoy, subscribe. The Battle of Hydaspes was over, but its cost was real. Alexander's casualties were heavier than anything since Gaugamela. The fighting in the elephant lines had been some of the most brutal his men had ever endured. And then there was Bucephalus, the horse that had carried Alexander since boyhood, through Greece, through Persia, through the Hindu Kush, across every battlefield for years. Bucephalus died in the days after Hydaspes. Alexander was devastated. He founded a city on the far bank and named it after him, Bucephala. But grief had no room to breathe, because beyond the river, beyond the forests of Punjab, scouts were bringing back reports of what waited further east. The Nanda Empire, vast armies, more elephants, an enemy that promised yet another campaign at the edge of the known world. Alexander wanted to keep going. His men did not. 8 years into the campaign, thousands of miles from home, their armor cracked, their sandals worn through, their friends buried from Greece to India, they had had enough. At the Hydaspes River, weeks after his greatest tactical masterpiece, Alexander the Great met the only wall he could never break. Not a king, not a river, not 100 war elephants, his own men. He turned the army around, and he never marched east again. The journey home was not a triumph. Marching south through the Indus Valley, Alexander was nearly killed storming the walls of a Malian city. An arrow pierced his lung. He survived, barely. By the time the army reached Babylon in 323 BCE, Alexander had been campaigning for 13 years. He was 32 years old. In June of that year, after days of fever, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. The cause is still debated. His generals gathered around the bed and asked who should inherit the empire. His answer, by most accounts, the strongest. Within a generation, everything he built had been divided. The empire fractured. But his name did not disappear. From Egypt to the edge of India, Alexander outlived his empire in memory. 32 years old, undefeated in battle, never turned back by an enemy. The only thing that ever stopped Alexander the Great was the loyalty of the men who loved him too much to follow him any further. That's the kind of leader he was. And that's why Hydaspes matters. If you made it this far, you already know what to do. But history doesn't end here. Watch the next video now.